Have you ever had one of those moments where a single sentence shatters everything you thought you knew about your life? Where the people who are supposed to love you most reveal exactly how little you mean to them? At my brother's Harvard graduation, and what I discovered next about my family's finances made me realize I'd been living a carefully orchestrated lie for 4 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a pharmacy technician at Riverside Community Pharmacy in Riverside, Ohio, a small industrial town where everyone knows everyone else's business. Most days I count pills, answer insurance questions, and help elderly customers understand their medications. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills for my tiny one-bedroom apartment on Maple Street. What most people don't know is that every night after my shift ends, I come home and study for the MCAT. See, I used to have bigger dreams. 4 years ago, I was a pre-med student at Riverside Community College, planning to transfer to Ohio State University. I had a 3.8 GPA, volunteer hours at Memorial Hospital, and acceptance letters waiting for me. I was going to be a doctor, help people, make my family proud. Then my parents sat me down one March evening and told me David had gotten into Harvard. Not just accepted full admission to one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The problem was, even with financial aid, they couldn't afford to send him. That's when my mother, Linda, looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, the words that would define the next 4 years of my life, "Maya, honey, we need you to make a sacrifice for the family. David's opportunity is once in a lifetime. You can always go back to school later, but Harvard doesn't wait for anyone." I remember staring at them across our kitchen table, the acceptance letter to Ohio State still pinned to our refrigerator behind my father's head. Bob Chen, my dad, owned a small auto repair shop that barely kept us afloat. My mother worked part-time doing bookkeeping at the hospital. They weren't asking me to help, they were telling me my dreams had to die so David's could live. I dropped out the next week. For 4 years, I worked double shifts. I took a job at the pharmacy, picked up weekend work at a grocery store, and even cleaned offices at night. Every paycheck, every tip, every extra dollar went toward David's education. Room and board at Harvard, textbooks that cost more than my monthly rent, spring break trips to Europe that he called cultural enrichment, and a laptop that cost 3 times what I made in a month. I told myself it was temporary, that I was investing in our family's future, that David would remember this sacrifice and help me later. My parents made sure I knew how important my contribution was. Every family dinner became a report on David's achievements. David made Dean's List again. David joined the debate team. David got an internship at a law firm in Boston. They'd beam with pride and then turn to me and say, "Maya, we couldn't have done this without you. You're such a good sister." I lived for those moments of recognition. I thought I was part of something bigger than myself. The graduation ceremony was held on a perfect May morning in Harvard Yard. I'd requested the day off work, bought a new dress with money I probably shouldn't have spent, and drove 8 hours from Riverside to Cambridge. It was the first time I'd seen David in 6 months. He'd been too busy with senior activities to come home for Christmas or spring break. As I watched him walk across that stage in his cap and gown, I felt this overwhelming sense of pride mixed with something I couldn't quite name at the time. After the ceremony, we took photos in front of the iconic red brick buildings. David looked confident, polished every inch the Harvard graduate. My parents flanked him on either side, their faces glowing with accomplishment, stood slightly apart, taking pictures with David's phone because he wanted to post them on social media immediately. That's when a woman approached us, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, David's academic advisor. She was elegant, well-spoken, and clearly impressed with my brother. "You must be so proud," she said to my parents. "David has mentioned how much his family has supported him financially throughout his time here. It's wonderful when families prioritize education." My mother smiled that tight smile she wore when she was particularly pleased with herself. "Well, we believe in investing in the future. David is going to do great things." Dr. Hendricks nodded, then looked at me. "And are you in school as well, dear?" The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Yeah. I opened my mouth to speak, but my father answered first. Maya decided college wasn't for her. She's more of a practical, hands-on person. She works at a pharmacy. The way he said it, like working at a pharmacy, was something to be ashamed of. It made my cheeks burn. Dr. Hendricks smiled politely and excused herself, but I caught the brief look of confusion that crossed her face. We went to dinner at an expensive restaurant near campus, the kind of place where the bread costs more than my usual lunch. David ordered wine and talked about his plans law school, maybe a year abroad first. Definitely something in corporate law where he could really make an impact. My parents hung on every word. I mostly stayed quiet, picking at my salad and listening to them plan David's future. When the check came, my father reached for his wallet, but David waved him off. "Dad, let me get this. I've got that signing bonus from the firm, remember?" Signing bonus? David already had a job lined up at a prestigious law firm in Boston, starting at more money than I'd make in 3 years. He paid the $300 dinner bill like it was nothing. As we walked back to our cars, David pulled me aside. "Maya, I just want you to know I appreciate everything you've done, the sacrifices you've made. I know it wasn't easy." For a moment, I thought this was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for, the moment when he'd tell me he was going to help me get back to school, that my turn was coming. Instead, he hugged me and said, "I'm really proud of you for finding your place in the world. Not everyone is meant for college, and that's okay." I stood there, frozen, as the words hit me. Not everyone is meant for college. Like I hadn't had a 3.8 GPA. Like I hadn't been accepted to Ohio State. Like I hadn't given up my dreams to fund his. But the real blow came when we reached the parking area. My parents were standing by their car, and I overheard my mother talking to my father in a voice she thought I couldn't hear. "I'm so proud of David. He really showed Maya what's possible when you apply yourself. Maybe now she'll understand that some people are meant for bigger things, and some people are meant to support them." My father nodded. Good thing Maya knows her place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's going to need family support as he builds his career. My mother looked directly at me then, and I realized she knew I'd heard every word. She smiled, the same smile she'd worn for Dr. Hendricks, and said loud enough for David to hear, "Maya, dear, now you know your place in this family. We couldn't be prouder of how you've supported your brother's success." The words hit me like a physical blow. Now you know your place. Not thank you. Not your turn is coming. Not we're proud of you too. It's just a clear, definitive statement about my role in their hierarchy. I managed to say goodbye, hugged David one more time, and told my parents I loved them. I made it to my car before the tears started, as I sat in the parking lot of Harvard University, watching my family drive away in the car that David's signing. Bonus would probably replace soon. I realized that everything I'd believed about my sacrifice, about temporary hardship, about family love, had been a carefully constructed illusion. I wasn't investing in our family's future. I was funding David's life while mine stood still. I wasn't being a good sister. I was being a convenient source of income, and I wasn't going to get my turn later. This was my place, as they saw it, and they expected me to stay in it forever. The 8-hour drive back to Riverside gave me plenty of time to think. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex at 2 in the morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to accept their version of my place in the world anymore. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I'd been paying for all these years. And what I discovered when I started digging into the finances would prove that my family's betrayal went even deeper than I'd imagined. The Monday morning after David's graduation, I woke up in my small apartment, feeling like I was seeing my life through different eyes. The same cramped kitchen, the same secondhand furniture, the same stack of Mac prep books gathering dust on my nightstand. Everything looked exactly the same. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't rushing to get ready for work while mentally calculating how much of my paycheck would go toward David's expenses. Instead, I found myself wondering what my life might have looked like if I'd never dropped out of school. Growing up in the Chen household meant understanding your role early. My parents, Bob and Linda, had immigrated from Taiwan when I was 3, and David was 1. They worked incredibly hard to build a life in Riverside, with my father eventually opening his small auto repair shop and my mother finding steady work in hospital billing. They spoke often about the American dream, about education being the key to a better life, about sacrificing today for tomorrow's opportunities. I absorbed these lessons completely, becoming the responsible older sister who helped with homework, chores, and eventually family finances. David was different from the start. Where I was careful and studious, he was charming and confident. Where I saved my allowance, he spent it immediately and somehow always talked our parents into advancing him more. I told myself this was just personality differences, that we both contributed to the family in our own ways. When David struggled with math in middle school, I tutored him for hours every night. When he wanted to join expensive extracurricular activities, I babysat neighbors' kids to help cover the costs. When he needed a laptop for high school, I worked extra shifts at the grocery store, where I'd gotten my first job at 16. Looking back now, I can see how naturally I fell into the role of David's enabler. My parents praised me for being such a good big sister and so mature for your age. They talked about how David had natural leadership qualities and the kind of charisma that opens doors. Meanwhile, my academic achievements were acknowledged with a quick, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation inevitably turned back to David's latest accomplishment or need. The pattern became so ingrained that when my parents announced David's Harvard acceptance, my first thought wasn't about my own college plans, it was about how we could make his dream work. I'd been conditioned to see his success as our family's success, and my role as the one who made it possible. The fact that this meant sacrificing my own education felt not just natural but noble. I was investing in something bigger than myself. After I dropped out of Riverside Community College, I threw myself into working with the same dedication I'd once applied to my studies. I picked up shifts wherever I could find them, learning to function on 4 hours of sleep and instant coffee. The pharmacy job was the most stable, and Tom Rodriguez, the owner, quickly recognized my work ethic and attention to detail. Within 6 months, he'd promoted me to senior technician and started trusting me with more complex responsibilities. But the money never seemed to be enough. Harvard's costs kept climbing, and David's needs expanded to match. First, it was just tuition and basic room and board. Then, he needed money for textbooks, lab fees, and a computer upgrade. By sophomore year, he was asking for funds to join expensive clubs, attend networking events, and participate in study abroad programs. Each request came through my parents, who would call me with detailed explanations of why this particular expense was crucial for David's future. "Maya, David has the chance to spend a semester in London," my mother would say. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that will look amazing on his law school applications. The program costs $8,000, but think about the doors it will open for him." I remember standing in my tiny kitchen, still in my pharmacy uniform after a 12-hour shift, calculating whether I could afford to give up eating lunch for the next few months to help cover the cost. The math never quite worked, but somehow I always found a way. I took on weekend work cleaning offices, sold my old textbooks, and even donated plasma when things got really tight. What made it bearable was the sense that I was part of David's journey. My parents would call me with updates about his grades, his professors' praise, his summer internship opportunities. I felt connected to his achievements, like I was attending Harvard by proxy. When he made Dean's List, I celebrated. When he got a research position with a prominent professor, I felt proud. When he was selected for the London program I'd helped fund, I genuinely felt like we'd accomplished something together.
Oh.
The requests for money became more frequent during David's junior year. He needed professional clothes for interviews, money to visit law schools, funds for LSAT prep courses, and application fees. Each expense was presented as an investment in his future, and by extension, our family's future. My parents would mention how grateful David was, how he always asked about me, how he couldn't wait to pay everyone back once he started his career. I started working a third job that year, doing inventory for a medical supply company on Sunday. Mornings, my weeks became a blur of pills counted, floors mopped, and Excel spreadsheets filled out.
Ow.
I developed chronic back pain from being on my feet so much, and I couldn't afford to see a doctor about it. But every time I felt sorry for myself, I'd think about David in his dorm room, studying late into the night, making the most of the opportunity I was helping provide. My social life evaporated completely. Friends from high school moved away for college or got caught up in their own lives. I stopped dating because I never had time or money for it. When coworkers invited me out for drinks after work, I'd make excuses about being tired or having other plans. The truth was that every dollar spent on myself felt like money stolen from. David's education, isolation became so complete that I started looking forward to my parents' weekly update calls about David's progress. These conversations became my main connection to a world beyond work and sleep. I'd ask detailed questions about his classes, his professors, his social life. I wanted to know everything, to feel like I was living vicariously through the opportunities my sacrifice had created. During David's senior year, the financial pressure reached its peak. Law school application fees, interview travel costs, and senior year activities all required funding. But there was also something else. David had developed expensive tastes. He was eating at restaurants I couldn't afford, buying clothes from brands I'd never heard of, and taking weekend trips with friends who came from wealthy families. When I gently questioned some of these expenses during one of our rare phone conversations, he laughed and said, "Maya, you have to understand. Networking is everything here. These relationships are investments in my future." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that every sacrifice I was making served a purpose, that the sleepless nights and constant financial stress were building towards something meaningful. But small doubts started creeping in. When David posted photos on social media from expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, I wondered if my money was really going toward education or just maintaining a lifestyle he felt entitled to. The doubts became harder to ignore when I realized I hadn't spoken to David directly in months. All communication went through our parents, who would relay his gratitude and promises to stay in touch better. When I suggested visiting him at school, there was always a reason why it wasn't a good time: exams, interviews, important social events I wouldn't want to interrupt. I started to feel less like a sister supporting her brother and more like a distant investor funding a stranger's life. But I pushed these feelings down, reminding myself that David was under enormous pressure, and that my feelings didn't matter as much as his success. I told myself that once graduation came, once he started his career, everything would change. He'd have time for family again, and more importantly, he'd be in a position to help me pursue my own dreams. The sacrifices were temporary, I convinced myself. The payoff was coming. By the time David's graduation approached, I'd been working 3 jobs for almost 4 years. I'd contributed over $60,000 to his education, money I'd scraped together from every source I could find. I'd given up my own college dreams, my social life, my health, and my youth. But I genuinely believed it had all been worth it, that I was about to witness the culmination of our family's collective effort. Standing in Harvard Yard that May morning, watching David walk across the stage, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, yes, but also a deep exhaustion and a growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic I'd accepted for so long. When my parents made their comment about knowing my place, it was like a switch flipped in my brain. Suddenly, all those suppressed doubts came flooding back, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. The 8-hour drive home gave me time to think about conversations I'd dismissed, requests that had seemed reasonable at the time but now felt excessive, and most importantly, my parents' attitude toward my contribution. They'd never once suggested that my sacrifice was temporary or that my turn would come. They'd simply accepted my financial support as my natural role in the family, and David had done the same. I started to realize that what I'd interpreted as family loyalty and temporary sacrifice had actually been systematic exploitation. I hadn't been investing in our collective future. I'd been funding David's lifestyle while my own life remained perpetually on hold. And based on my parents' comments at graduation, they expected this arrangement to continue indefinitely. The really painful part was recognizing how many warning signs I'd ignored along the way. David's increasing sense of entitlement, my parents. Casual dismissal of my own ambitions. The way conversations about David's expenses never included discussions about when I might return to school. I'd rationalized every red flag, explaining away every uncomfortable moment because I needed to believe that my sacrifice meant something. But now, sitting in my small apartment at 2 a.m. after the graduation ceremony, I couldn't maintain that illusion anymore. I needed to understand exactly what I'd been paying for all these years. And more importantly, I needed to figure out what to do with the crushing realization that my family saw me not as a person with my own dreams and potential, but as a convenient source of funding for David's ambitions. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't thinking about David's future or my parents' expectations. I was thinking about what I wanted and what I deserved. What I deserved was a lot more than being told I should be grateful for knowing. My place. The Tuesday morning after my revelation, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I needed time to think, to process what had happened at the graduation, and most importantly, to start asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. I made myself coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, determined to reconstruct the financial reality of the past 4 years. I started with what I knew for certain. I'd kept meticulous records of every dollar I'd sent to my parents for David's education, partly out of habit, and partly because I'd always planned to show David someday exactly how much the family had invested in his success. The total was staggering $63,427 over 4 years. That number represented thousands of hours of work, countless sacrifices, and almost every penny I'd earned beyond basic survival expenses. But as I sat there with my calculator and bank statements, something started to bother me. I'd always assumed that my contribution was the bulk of David's funding, with my parents covering smaller expenses and Harvard's financial aid handling the rest. I'd never actually seen a breakdown of the total costs or how they were being covered. My parents had always presented David's expenses as they arose, making it seem like each request was an isolated need rather than part of a larger financial picture. Curiosity finally overcoming my habitual deference, I decided to do some research. I pulled up Harvard's official website and found their published costs for undergraduate students. Tuition, room and board, fees, books, and personal expenses. The total came to roughly $75,000 per year. Over 4 years, that meant David's education had cost around $300,000. The math didn't add up. Even with financial aid, which typically covers only a portion of costs for middle-income families, there had to be significant funding sources I wasn't aware of. My $63,000, while substantial for me, represented only about 20% of the total cost. Where was the rest coming from? I called Harvard's financial aid office, pretending to be a prospective student's sister seeking information. The woman I spoke with was helpful, explaining that students typically fund their education through a combination of family contributions, financial aid, student loans, and work-study programs. She mentioned that many families take out private loans or tap into savings and retirement accounts to cover expenses that financial aid doesn't cover. Private loans and retirement accounts? My parents had never mentioned taking on debt for David's education. In fact, they'd consistently framed my financial contributions as necessary precisely because they couldn't afford to pay for Harvard themselves. They'd told me repeatedly that without my help, David wouldn't be able to attend. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since the graduation. I found my mother in the kitchen, sorting through mail, and my father in the garage working on a neighbor's car. They seemed surprised to see me, but welcomed me warmly, asking how I was processing David's big day and whether I'd heard from him. Since the ceremony, I decided to approach the topic indirectly. Mom, I've been thinking about David's student loans. When does he have to start paying them back? My mother looked confused. Student loans? David doesn't have any student loans? Honey, we made sure of that. The words hit me like a physical blow. No student loans? But how did you cover the costs? I know I helped, but Harvard is so expensive. My father had wandered in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. Oh, we managed. Your grandfather Frank helped out quite a bit. and we took some money from our retirement savings. Plus, David got better financial aid than we expected. Grandfather Frank, my mother's father, who lived in a modest house across town and had always been my favorite relative. He'd worked for the Postal Service for 40 years, lived frugally, and had always been generous with family members in need. I'd had no idea he was contributing to David's education. "How much did Grandpa Frank contribute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. My parents exchanged a look. "Well, he was very generous," my mother said vaguely. "He wanted to help ensure David had every opportunity." I pressed gently. "In the retirement savings. How much did you have to use?" Another exchanged look. "Maya, why all these questions?" "David's graduated now. The expenses are over." But I couldn't let it go. Something in their evasiveness was triggering all the instincts I'd suppressed for years. "I'm just curious about the full picture. I contributed a lot of money, and I'd like to understand how everything worked out." My father's tone became slightly defensive. "Contributed what you could, and we're grateful for that. But we never asked you to keep track of every detail." That phrase, "what you could," stuck with me. It implied that my contribution had been voluntary, a gesture of support rather than the systematic sacrifice I'd made. It erased the reality of my dropped classes, abandoned dreams, and years of working multiple jobs. I decided to be more direct. "Dad, I gave up college to help pay for David's education. I worked 3 jobs for 4 years and contributed over $60,000. I think I have a right to understand how that money was actually used." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, my mother spoke. "Maya, we appreciate everything you did, but you're making it sound like we forced you to give up school. You made that choice yourself." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed it. But then I remembered the conversation 4 years ago, when they'd told me David's opportunity was once in a lifetime and I could always go back to school later. There had been no discussion of alternatives, no mention of other funding sources, no suggestion that my sacrifice might not be necessary. "You told me David couldn't go to Harvard without my help," I said quietly. "You said the family needed me to make a sacrifice?" My father shrugged. "We said a lot of things. Families help each other out. But we never put a gun to your head." Their casual dismissal of my sacrifice was breathtaking. My life, my education, my dreams reduced to families help each other out, as if I'd occasionally helped with groceries rather than funding my brother's entire lifestyle. I tried one more approach. "What about now? I'd like to go back to school. Since David's graduated and doing well, maybe the family can help me the way I helped him." The look my parents shared this time was different, annoyed, almost incredulous. "Maya, you're 26 years old," my mother said. "You can't expect us to pay for college at your age. Besides, you have a good job. Why would you want to start over?" My father nodded. "College isn't for everyone. You found your place in the world. David needed that education for his career, but you're doing fine as you are." There it was again, the message that had been delivered so clearly at the graduation. I had found my place, and that place was supporting David rather than pursuing my own ambitions. The idea that I might deserve the same opportunities they'd enthusiastically funded for him was apparently absurd. I left their house that evening feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe my family viewed my contribution not as a temporary sacrifice that would be reciprocated, but as my natural role in supporting David's success. They had no intention of helping me return to school, and they seemed genuinely confused by the idea that I might expect such help. But more disturbing was the revelation that my financial contribution might not have been as crucial as they'd led me to believe. If Grandfather Frank had contributed significantly, if they'd used retirement savings, if David had received better financial aid than expected, then my $63,000 might have been supplementary rather than essential. I might have given up my education for something that would have happened anyway. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word and gesture. My parents' defensiveness when I asked about money, their dismissal of my sacrifice as voluntary, their incredulity at the idea of helping me return to school, it all painted a picture of a family that had systematically exploited my willingness to help while making me believe I was essential to David's success. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I was going to find out exactly how David's education had been funded, who had contributed what, and whether my sacrifice had been necessary at all. I owed myself that much truth, even if it meant discovering that I'd been manipulated for 4 years. I started with Grandfather Frank, at 82. He was still sharp, independent, and had always been more direct than my parents. I drove to his small house that afternoon, bringing groceries and telling him I wanted to catch up after David's graduation. Grandpa Frank was delighted to see me as always. He made tea and asked about my work, my health, my plans. Unlike my parents, he never seemed to assume that my current life was necessarily my permanent situation. When the conversation naturally turned to David's graduation, I saw my opening. Grandpa, I'm so proud of what David accomplished. The whole family really came together to make it possible. He nodded enthusiastically. Indeed we did. I was happy to help. Education is the most important investment you can make. I know Mom and Dad mentioned you contributed. That was incredibly generous of you. Grandpa Frank waved a hand dismissively. What else is money for? I paid for half of David's expenses over the 4 years, nearly $150,000. But seeing him graduate from Harvard made every penny worth it. $150,000. My grandfather had contributed more than twice what I had, covering almost half of David's total expenses. Combined with my $63,000 and whatever financial aid David had received, there would have been little need for my parents to use retirement savings at all. In fact, there might have been no need for my contribution at all. The realization hit me like a freight train. My family had let me drop out of school, work 3 jobs, and sacrifice my dreams to contribute money that wasn't actually necessary. They'd allowed me to believe I was essential to David's education when they had other resources available. They'd watched me exhaust myself financially, physically, while never mentioning that my grandfather was already covering the bulk of expenses. I thanked Grandpa Frank for the tea, hugged him goodbye, and sat in his driveway for 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd learned. My family hadn't just taken advantage of my willingness to help, they'd actively deceived me about the necessity of my sacrifice. They'd let me destroy my own future to supplement funding that was already adequate. That evening, I finally understood that my parents' comment about knowing my place hadn't been a momentary cruelty. It had been an honest statement of how they viewed me not as a daughter with her own potential and dreams, but as a source of financial support whose natural role was to enable David's success. They'd never intended for my contribution to be temporary, and they'd never planned to help me pursue my own education. The betrayal was complete, and it was time to decide what I was going to do about it. For the first time in 4 years, I was going to prioritize my own future over my family's expectations. The only question was how far I was willing to go to reclaim the life they'd convinced me to give up. Armed with the truth about my grandfather's contribution, I spent the next week planning my next move. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my thinking for years was finally lifting, and I could see my situation with devastating clarity. My family had orchestrated an elaborate deception, allowing me to sacrifice my education while pretending my contribution was essential. When they already had adequate funding, I decided to seek guidance from Tom Rodriguez, my manager at the pharmacy. During a quiet afternoon shift, I explained my situation and my desire to return to school. Maya, you've been working here for 4 years, and I've never known anyone more dedicated, Tom said. If you want to pursue medicine, you absolutely should. Have you looked into programs for non-traditional students? I hadn't. For so long, I'd accepted my parents' narrative that my window for higher education had closed. But Tom's matter-of-fact tone suggested that returning to school at 26 wasn't impossible. That evening, I researched post-baccalaureate pre-med programs and discovered there were pathways specifically designed for adult learners like me. Then I remembered something Grandfather Frank had said. Education is the most important investment you can make. I wondered if he knew the full extent of what I'd sacrificed, whether he'd support my educational aspirations the way he'd supported David's. I visited him again, bringing dinner and settling in for a serious conversation. I told him everything, how I'd dropped out to fund David's education, how I'd been working multiple jobs for 4 years, and how I'd recently learned about his substantial contribution. Grandfather Frank listened intently, his expression growing serious. Maya, I had no idea you'd given up college for David. Your parents told me you'd decided school wasn't for you, that you preferred working. I would never have agreed to help fund David's education if I'd known you were sacrificing your own. Learning that my parents had lied to my grandfather about my situation added another layer to their deception. Grandpa, I want to go back. To school, I want to pursue medicine like I originally planned. His response was immediate. Maya, if you're serious about returning to school, I'll help you. The same way I helped David. It's only fair. That weekend, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable before. I was going to confront my family with everything I'd learned. I spent Sunday creating a comprehensive file with bank statements, work records, and detailed notes from my conversations with my parents and grandfather. Monday evening, I asked my parents if I could come over for dinner. After we ate, I placed my folder on the kitchen table. I need to discuss something important. I've learned some concerning things. About David's education funding? I know about Grandfather Frank's contribution, I began. I know he paid nearly half of David's expenses, about $150,000. I also know David received substantial financial aid and graduated without student loans. My parents' expressions shifted from puzzlement to panic. Maya, what are you getting at? My father asked. I'm getting at the fact that you let me drop out of college and work 3 jobs to contribute. $63,000 to an education that was already fully funded. You watched me sacrifice my future for something that wasn't necessary. My mother immediately went into damage control. You never said your contribution was the only funding. You offered to help, and we were grateful. You did, I replied. Pulling out documents, you told me David's opportunity was once in a lifetime, that I could always go back to school later, and that the family needed me to make a sacrifice. You presented my education as expendable and David's as essential. My father tried deflecting. Your contribution was still meaningful. It allowed us to give David the best experience without taking on debt. So you admit my contribution wasn't necessary? That I could have stayed in school while David still attended Harvard? The silence confirmed everything. What I'd asked about the family helping me return to school, they dismissed it as unreasonable. It's telling me I was too old and had found my place in the world. I'm not asking you to fund my education, I continued. Grandfather Frank has offered to help. What I want is acknowledgement that you deceived me about the necessity of my contribution and consistently prioritized David's opportunities over mine. Neither parent would provide that acknowledgement. They insisted I'd freely chosen to help David and that they'd never promised reciprocal support. The conversation grew heated, with accusations flying in both directions. Finally, I stood up and collected my documents. I want you to understand something clearly. I'm done enabling David's lifestyle and your favoritism. I won't be contributing to any more family expenses. I'm returning to school and building the life I should have had 4 years ago. My father's response was telling. Maya, you're being selfish. Family means helping each other out. I left that night knowing the relationship would never be the same, but feeling lighter than I had in years. The fallout was swift. My parents called repeatedly, alternating between guilt trips and reconciliation attempts. David finally called, confused after hearing their version of events. Maya, I don't understand. I thought you were happy with your choices. I explained the situation calmly. David's response revealed how completely he'd accepted the family narrative about my role. But you've always been the practical one. College isn't really your thing, is it? David, I had a 3.8 GPA and acceptance letters to Ohio State when I dropped out to help fund your education. College was absolutely my thing. After a pause, he said, well, I'm going to earn more than you could have anyway. So financially, it made sense to invest in my education first. That statement encapsulated everything wrong with my family's value system. My worth was measured solely by earning potential. Since David's prospects were more lucrative, my dreams were automatically less valuable. 3 months later, I was enrolled in a post-baccalaureate pre-med program. Grandfather Frank provided initial funding, and I qualified for additional financial aid. I kept my pharmacy job part-time and commuted to classes. It was exhausting, but exhilarating to be learning again. My parents made sporadic reconciliation attempts but never acknowledged their deception. David maintained minimal contact, occasionally sending updates through our parents, but never addressing the unfairness of our family dynamics. 2 years into my program, David sent a wedding invitation with a letter expressing hope we could rebuild our relationship. But it contained a revealing paragraph. I know things have been tense, but everything worked out for the best. We all found our paths, even if they weren't what we originally planned. The implication that I'd simply found a different path rather than been forced off my original one showed he still didn't understand what had happened. Today I'm in my final year of medical school. I'll graduate at 31, 6 years later than planned, but with a clearer sense of purpose. My relationship with my parents has stabilized into polite distance. Grandfather Frank and I have grown much closer, and he's become the supportive family member I'd always hoped my parents would be. Looking back, I don't regret standing up for myself. The alternative, continuing to live a diminished life while pretending everything was fine, would have been much worse. Learned that loyalty to family doesn't require accepting mistreatment. And sometimes the people who love you most are the ones most willing to limit your potential. My advice to anyone in a similar situation: your dreams matter, regardless of what your family thinks. If the people who are supposed to support you are instead limiting your potential, it's not disloyalty to prioritize your own future. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting other people's assessment of your worth. The years I lost were real, but the life I'm building now is entirely my own, free from manipulation and diminished expectations. That freedom is worth every difficult conversation and burned bridge that led me here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.